Alice Pung is best-selling author of the memoirs Unpolished Gem and Her Father's Daughter. She was also editor of the anthology Growing Up Asian in Australia. Her novel 100 Days was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. Alice Pung is in conversation with Pookong Kee, the immediate past BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University and Emeritus Professor at the University of Melbourne. The Foundation for Australian Studies in China acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which this interview was conducted.
A warm welcome, Alice.
Thank you so much, Professor Kee. Thank you for having me.
You started writing at a young age. I'm impressed to learn that you have kept a diary since you were 8 years old, and that you started sending short stories in for publication when you were only 19. What do you believe led to this interest in writing, and what have been the major milestones in your journey as a literary writer so far?
Oh, well, my interest in writing started only because it was a way to voice my feelings, to be honest. So I'm the oldest of 4 children, and my parents are Chinese, ethnic Chinese born in Cambodia. And so when they came to Australia, they had 4 children. And as part of a traditional family, the eldest looks after the youngest. And it was quite frustrating looking after younger siblings. And we didn't have Facebook or the internet at that time. So, my friends, mostly who were Australian-born, Anglo-Australians, didn't seem to have exactly the same childhood as I did. They'd visit each other's houses, they would play, and if they were to look after siblings, it would be considered babysitting, not almost looking after them as if they were your own kids. And so I was really frustrated, and my mother always told me many, many times when my sisters were born that I should never shake a baby, because if you shake a baby, you could damage the baby's brain. So if you imagine if you're an 8-year-old, you're really frustrated, instead of doing something terrible to my younger siblings, I had this notebook. It was very, cheap notebook I got from the supermarket, and I just wrote in there how angry I was at my parents, and it made me feel a bit better. So I just continued to write. And writing for me, as for anyone who's ever kept a diary, is you find that you write at the times you're most angry and frustrated or sad or heartbroken. Generally, when you're happy, you write 2 or 3 sentences. I'm so happy, So, it was a way of me to relieve pressure and vent my emotions. It was a very healthy and therapeutic thing for me. So I just continued doing it all my life, even now.
You have drawn on your Chinese, Cambodian, and Chaozhou or Teochew heritage in your memoirs, novels, short stories, and other writing. For those in our audience who are yet to read your work, can you give us some examples of how this culture is felt, interpreted, and conveyed in your writing?
Oh, sure. So, I grew up grappling between 2 cultures, and my Teochew heritage didn't make sense outside the home. So I think my writing was a way for me to reconcile to myself, even before I knew I was doing this, these 2 cultures that were always at odds with each other and sometimes quite conflicted. So my mother and father speak Teochew to me at home. And when I go to school, of course, it's all in English. But my mother doesn't read or write, and when I was growing up, didn't speak much English at all, because with a lot of immigrant women, the women stay at home and the men go out to work. So my mother's world was really small and constricted. And so she always got me to translate for her in public. And so from a very young child, you were undertaking quite adult responsibilities of translating this new, this foreign language to your mother. And sometimes, for example, translating the phone bill, and my mother couldn't read, so she'd say, "Why did they charge us $2.17 extra why are they ripping us off? And she'd get quite loud and vocal about it. And I would be on the phone at the age of 14 trying to explain to the lady on the phone that, yes, I was Mrs. Pung, and I was deeply disappointed that our phone bill was a bit overcharged in the most polite language possible, while my mother was yelling in Teochew, why are they doing this? In the most profane terms, just because that was the way she expressed her anger. And so writing was a way for me to kind of reconcile these two voices and to understand them. And culturally, Teochew is what they call a medieval language. If for linguists out there, it's not to say that it's very old-fashioned, which sometimes it is, but it's got the tone and cadence of a medieval language. And so you're speaking this very, this very formal language to your parents, and then you go to school and you see other people's parents who have a more democratic relationships. So that was another thing that I had to reconcile as an Asian Australian, how differently parents love their children as well. All legitimate forms of love, but one is more hierarchical than the other. And that is not recognised when you go to school. And some friends of yours will say, "What? Your parents say that to you? You better call Kids Helpline." That's kind of child abuse when it's just your parenting. Yeah.
Your first visit to China was in 2008 when you were based at Peking University as part of an Asia Link Writers and Residents Fellowship. Can you please share with us your impressions from that first encounter with China?
Oh, sure. So I was 27 at that time, and it was the first time I'd lived outside of home for an extended period of time. So I was in Beijing for 3 months at Peking University, such a beautiful place. And when I arrived in China, it was, the middle of winter, so it was really cold. And I come from Australia where we've never seen snow before. So that was the biggest shock, was temperature-wise. And the second one was Beijing University was a lot like a university in Australia. You go to a different country and you've never, like I'm a bit of a, country bumpkin. I've never been outside my suburb. You go and you expect everything to be different, including the trees and the buildings to look very Chinese. And the university was a wonderful surprise because it reminded me of living at the college I do, Janet Clarke Hall. Students had meal cards. The food was a lot better than what you would get in Australia. And I picked up a bit of Mandarin quite quickly and befriended some students, not just from Peking University, but from surrounding universities as well. So I settled in quite quickly and I felt right at home because I'd grown up in a country where, you're Asian Australian, so you look a bit different from, and then you go to China and you're completely, you've got black hair, you look like everyone else. It's a wonderful feeling to belong, which I never quite had. The other thing that really touched me in China, it was so ridiculous, was just watching Chinese television and seeing the toothpaste commercials have, Asian people in them brushing their teeth, which means that your family is normalized, that's the normal standard of living. Whereas in Australia, you never see your family on television commercials. You don't consume the products. You don't exist in the suburbs. When in reality, most of my friends were Asian or Lebanese or Turkish or Macedonian. We just don't exist in mainstream culture. So it was such a beautiful feeling to see that you exist in the world, in an alternate world.
Our audience may be surprised to learn that your family's ancestral hometown is in the Chaoshan region of Guangdong province. Do you feel more connected to your Chinese roots after your visit to the ancestral hometown? And what surprised you the most on that visit?
Oh, yeah. So my grandparents came from the Taozhou province in a place called Jieyang. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but in Deojiu it's called Gekinyo. That's where my grandmother was born. And so I went back there with a friend from Guangzhou who spoke Cantonese and a friend from England who'd been my pen friend for 15 years. So we met for the first time in China. So that was quite special. So then we went to Taozhou and for the first time in my life, both my friends, one from England and one from Guangzhou, turned to me and said, "This is your hometown. We don't understand the language. You speak to these people now." So at the hotel and the restaurants and at the, buses and the boat ferries, I had to speak Teochew. And I felt right at home. The Teochew people are really welcoming. That they probably didn't know that I was one of them, to be honest, because everywhere I went, they'd say, "Oh, Moela yu kiang le bak down Teochew." That they thought I was some foreigner who just learnt this language because my Teochew is so Australianized. But they could understand me. It was a wonderful feeling to be understood in that way. And I visited my grandmother's ancestral village where she said she was, it was a village. It had chickens and ducks and cows and things like that. And it wasn't a village. It was a big city. It was probably, as large as Melbourne. It was more modernized than Melbourne. Went to the main street for the first time at night, and young Teochew children were playing American rap music. It was the most baffling thing I'd ever seen. And so I realized I had a frozen historical perception of my grandmother's village, which had completely modernized. So I couldn't find it anywhere. But it was a wonderful experience anyhow.
It's a very common migrant experience.
It is, yeah.
Earlier waves of Italian and Greek migrants often, remember Greece and Italy over time past, and that experiences are often referred to as the frozen clock syndrome.
Yeah, that's so true. And the values are frozen a bit as well. Yeah.
Alice, Melbourne is a diverse Australian city and a melting pot of our culture and history. You were born in Footscray, part of Melbourne's in western suburbs, a month after your parents arrived in Australia as immigrants. Can you tell us how the suburbs have influenced your life and provided a source of inspiration for your writing?
Yeah, the suburbs were all I knew when I was growing up, and just two particular suburbs, the suburb of Footscray, which is very working class, and the suburb of Braybrook, which is where all the factories were. So we grew up behind a carpet factory that let out some really awful fumes when it was in operation. So at least 5 days a week, we'd all go to school smelling like methane, but every other kid smelt the same, so it was fine. So I grew up in a very distinct suburban area, the working class suburbs of Melbourne, which were huge melting pots. So as you mentioned, Professor Kee, the Italian and Greek immigrants came before us, and the Eastern Europeans, the Polish, the Croatian, and then after us came the immigrants from the Horn of Africa and from Burma. So it's all these cultures in these suburbs. So I grew up, the suburbs influenced me just because I took it for granted that Australia was multicultural. I mentioned one of my best friends was Turkish, another was Vietnamese, another was, all different cultures, Sikh, Indian. So we thought that was normal. What wasn't normal was when we turned on television and didn't see people like us, or when we read books and most of Australia was white and middle class, not ethnic and working class. And so that was the disjuncture. And that's why I really make a point of putting in these multicultural suburbs in every single book I write. These are my settings, whether they're housing commission flats in the suburbs closer to the city, or whether they're the working class suburbs in which I grew up. Because if you write in Australia, predominantly the people who have time and money to write a middle class. So, they write about the suburbs they're familiar with. And when they venture into writing about housing commission or writing about the more shadier suburbs of Melbourne, the drugs and the gang warfare, they turn up the notch. So it's almost like a hyperbole. It's not the real suburbs in which I grew up with. So I keep thinking, well, I'm in a very unique position, one of the few working class authors that can write from this voice of authenticity. So that's why it's important my stories are augured in these places.
Your two memoirs, Unpolished Gem, published in 2006, and Her Father's Daughter, published in 2010, are rich with a recollection of your relations with your father, mother, and grandmother. Can you share with us some of the joys and challenges of growing up in a household with 3 generations under one roof?
Oh, that's an excellent question. There were such joys, Professor Kee, as it's so interesting. When I went to China, I realized many of the people who were young, their goal was to move out of home, just like children everywhere, to seek their independence. But I grew up in a multi-generational household where it was normal in Cambodia, in Vietnam. The greatest joy was my grandmother, this formidable woman who came from Tao Do, went to Cambodia because she was the first woman, or the first in her family to be educated. And I don't know why her parents were this enlightened, but she had a brother and they didn't educate him. They decided to educate their daughter instead. So they sent her to Teachers College to become a teacher, which is what she became in Cambodia. She was a primary school and high school teacher at the only Chinese language school in Cambodia. But in China, because she was educated, she started to write these articles that were published in the newspapers about how the landlords were taking away the rights of the non-land owning class. And so she was threatened, because she was writing these articles, which is why she ended up in Cambodia. She wasn't a starving peasant, unlike my mother's parents, who had to leave Cambodia because they were skin and bones. They were starving. My granddad, my mother's father, was dragged onto that boat. He could barely sit up because he was starving, and he made it to Cambodia. But my grandmother was different. She was in danger. So she was in Cambodia, and she married my grandpa, who was also a school teacher. And it was just heartbreaking when she left our house when she was when I was 8 years old. I think I was pretty depressed at that time. It was a big difference in my life from having this woman who I was the center of her universe to suddenly not only not having someone who loved me so much, but being responsible for a newborn baby, because my mother had my sister at that time. And she worked in the garage. She was what they call an outworker. So a lot of my aunties sewed clothes. My mother made jewelry. So she was in that garage for 10 hours a day. So, yeah, it was a real difference when my grandmother left for me.
Congratulations on your most recent widely acclaimed novel, 100 Days, which was just published this year while Melbourne was in lockdown because of COVID-19. In the book, you explore the theme of a mother-daughter relationship and the intersection of love, control, and freedom as experienced by the protagonist, a Chinese Filipino girl who becomes pregnant at the age of 16. Can you elaborate on the dynamics that you see at play between family love, control, and freedom in this novel, and how you believe these elements are influenced by Asian cultures?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure most people will have heard of that book by Amy Chua, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, which where she talks about how Asian parents are different, and her argument is that they're superior because their kids show results. Their kids do well in school, they go to university, they can play the violin and the flute, and her philosophy is you have to push your kids, otherwise they don't do these things. And then you grow up in the West, where the philosophy is that you don't push your kids to succeed. You try and help your kids find happiness. So that was what 100 Days was grappling with. But I didn't want the mother to be made into a caricature, because a tiger mother is a really loaded and racist term. It's what you say to dismiss a parent who wants the best for their child and has only one way of attaining it. Because if you come from China or even Vietnam or Cambodia, if you get well academically, it could change your life. It changes your life completely. And I've seen it in my lifetime from being in this really working class, rough suburb where you are, your place in society. You know that people dislike you. They tell it to your face. You chinks, get out of here. You're stealing our jobs. So from that to my relatively privileged middle-class existence, where the same sorts of people who would holler at me and yell at us and abuse us in the streets would come to me quite respectfully, because no longer do they see an Asian lawyer. They see someone who can help them with their workplace dispute, because I work with people who earn minimum wages, and I understand these people. They're so angry at new immigrants because they're scared of job loss, and that's it. No one is born racist. So that's what I wanted to grapple with in my book 100 Days. And I made my character biracial. So her dad is Anglo-Australian and her mother is Chinese from the Philippines, because I wanted to see what would happen with the clash of those two cultures, and with a very severe form of parenting that is born out of a kind of reactive parenting. Because when you're poor and you're stressed and you're parenting your child, you can only react, you can't be proactive. So I've seen it in my son's friends. Their parents will sit them down and say, Johnny, don't run across the road because we love you and we don't want you to get hit by a car and lose you. If that was my mum, she'd grab us by the seat of our pants and whack us and say, you stress me out so much. Can't you see how hard I'm working? And her hands would be all blackened from being in the garage. And, her temples would be throbbing. And you'd get a serious thrashing and you just deserve it. You just know what you've done. So that's a different form of parenting. There is no less love there. It's just your circumstances make you react instead of be proactive. So that was what I wanted to convey. And so far, the audience that is from an immigrant culture has been very empathetic. They say, that's my mum, And the audience that have grown up Anglo-Australian have reviewed this book and said this is not a book for young adults because it conveys child abuse. So, yeah, two different audiences.
Don't forget to watch part 2 of our interview with Alice Pung and our full collection of conversations with some of Australia's leading authors.